That's our scientific method. Where else should we be? And there's no other issue at the moment which is more front and centre to how we're going to shape. You talk about this transition, this transformation that is going to affect the lives of people, not just in Europe but around the world fundamentally. So I'd like to very much welcome on behalf of the European Commission this very important and timely report. The work that you do in the academies is the foundation to our, let's call it our civilization, if we're allowed to use words like that anymore. We underplay, I think, the value of the Enlightenment until we see that it's not actually functioning in certain parts of policy in certain parts of the world. So I think we take for granted sometimes the excellence and the brilliance and the contribution that our academies make quietly and otherwise in structuring the understanding that we have of what is happening in the world and how it's applied. I said timely because this report, it's not anybody's report. When the academies of science in Europe and the academies of science around the world speak, we should listen. This is not a think tank report. It is not a piece of assertion or opinion. It's been peer reviewed. And this is extremely helpful for those of us in both science and other policies to have a point of reference, to check what it is that we're thinking. We also need to be critical in our own thinking in terms of weighing up some of the decisions that will have to be made actually in the next weeks and months. So your report is extremely timely and it's very helpful. And Professor van der Meulen and Professor von Braun have actually had the leadership to give us the opportunity, not just for Europe, but for the global perspective, to start framing what the issues are in a way that we can interlink also with other policy areas. So what we're doing in research and innovation, what is happening or about to happen in agriculture, what will happen in development. We need some, I think we use very fancy words about interdisciplinarity and multi-policy approaches, but we need some joint-up thinking, and we also need to set some priorities. The cooperation in preparing this analysis has been very important to us. Also, it's given us a chance to really listen to hear what the scientific community is thinking. And as you probably know, we have established a scientific advisory mechanism at EU level to try and help the policy community in a structured way to engage with the academies and the scientific community. And this issue indeed is one of those that's in the air at the moment as to whether it merits a thorough investigation from the point of view of the scientific advisory mechanism. And I know that the academies are central to that thinking. So I think your report is timely in many ways. Some of you will have heard me talking, we've been talking, many of you have been talking about this, Joachim, you've been talking about this for a long time. Food and nutrition security are really front and centre in all of the problems that we're facing in moving from the system that we have with all its weaknesses to the system that needs to be developed very, very quickly. I tend to talk about, when we talk about the SDGs or the climate goals or the circular economy goals or all the goals that we have, I talk about there being 10 harvests when you talk about the scientific community. We more or less have 10 harvests to move our research and innovation forward to the point that the solutions will be there for the people who'll be facing the consequences of what's coming in a generation's time. So we in the policy community and the scientific community, we need to look at this analysis and say, right, what is the direction that we should be giving in our investment in science and research? Not picking winners, but participating in races, shall we say, against the clock. And I think your analysis helps us to understand that our instincts, our research, our policy discussions are moving in the right direction. I say also that in the world that we're living in, wherever you're living and whatever your perspectives, and they're very different, but they're becoming increasingly connected, there is no security without food security, and increasingly there will be no food security without food and nutrition security. I was talking to Tom Arnold, who you know, yesterday, about the half of the world's cities that will be built in the next 20 to 25 years. Are we going to repeat the problems that we've built in the West and in the East and different parts of the world? Or do we bring our heads together and try and share with these developing parts of the world how to get it right when there's an opportunity to do so? But you cannot do that if you don't have nutrition hardwired into the design of these next systems. It's not enough pumping calories from whatever sources into our societies. There's a whole systems rethink that's needed. So we need to think also as scientific and policy community about not just the inputs into the science that we need to get done, but the kind of areas where we need to have some kind of I don't like the word impact at this level, but some kind of options for the people who are going to be living and applying decisions in these spaces. And I think this report is very rich in directions of research and science that maybe will help us to think about accelerating a transition that's taking place. Very basic things. How do we minimize the inputs into how the food system is functioning? Water, energy, nutrients, chemically based pesticides. We've all got different ways of approaching the question, but we actually need to change it rather quickly. Almost a third of the climate impact of what we're seeing is coming out of these systems. What we call the carbon footprint, but that leaks into other aspects of greenhouse gases and other ways of doing business. What we call waste in the developed world is a tragic case of food losses in the developing world. So how do we apply what we know to what we grow, and then the appliance of science to fixing some of these problems? And who are the people we need to bring into the conversation, different parts of science, the interaction between the natural sciences and the social sciences and with policymakers. Access to proteins is going to be an enormous issue. And when we look at, I was at a presentation recently on modelling for fisheries, and a very simple issue of where the fish may go, putting it in very crude terms. If you're Indonesia, or if you're parts of West Africa, or if you're other parts of the world where 1.25 billion people depend on fisheries as their main source of protein, we have to start thinking about alternative sources of protein, in addition to the push for the Western diet and so forth. So there's enormous areas of research and innovation there. Our ecosystems, the systems themselves, you talked about the soil systems, the ocean systems. We've been working in the last few days with our colleagues across the Atlantic. What is it that we need to know about these systems? And how do we join up? There are fantastic efforts taking place in different parts of science. On the ocean side, for example, the observation community, the mapping community, the ecosystems community, the people doing the circulation. We need to bring them together and say, right, what is a fit-for-purpose observation system? Whether we're talking about the ocean stressors, or soil, or biodiversity, so that we're in a position as decisions are taken to see what the impact is and that we make the right kind of decisions. Very easy to say, very complex even to frame the conversation. And whatever we mean by yields in the future and how they're produced, how it affects what the toolkit that we have for plants, for animals, and how the public will buy into this, which I think is now front and centre. You've seen, if you've had the pleasure of suffering through the last few months in Brussels and around Brussels about approvals of things like glyphosates and so forth, you have in microcosm this gap that's taking place between practice and industry, the public, and the mediation of complex issues. So that's part of bringing together in the system, people are part of the system, the health and the well-being of consumers with the sustainability, which you pointed out very well in all of that. So a last couple of points I'd like to make. I mean, the relationship between science and research policy and the use of science and research policy for policymakers is a very difficult fit. And it's something that we're working very much on. You cannot simply have science and research driven by today's policies and today's solutions, what we call, making faster horses, or whatever your preferred analogy is. Nor can we have science and research doing wonderful things at a time when there's a need for urgent change. And I think this is a very difficult interface because the time frames are different, and the criteria are different, the processes are different, but it's one which we're going to have to bridge in the next framework programme. The next European Union framework programme, which will be called Horizon and will be for Europe, but for the world, its budget will be announced in the next couple of weeks, and the discussion and the presentation of the programme will follow in June. I think we're all in a very positive space about the recognition of the role that research, innovation and investment needs to take in accelerating all of these changes. I think there's been great support, not just from the scientific and industrial community, but politically. And that is a tribute to people like yourselves who have been doing, you said your feet are on the ground. The proof is in the pudding when you decide how you allocate your resources. I think there's a big investment and trust in the research, science and innovation community to help solve some of these issues that are there and seize the opportunities, opportunity being the key word. So I think we will see in the architecture of the next Horizon Framework Programme, you will have the ERC's outstanding role being supported. We will see a completion of all the instruments we need for the whole portfolio, from basic science right the way through to financial instruments and the innovation of bottom-up operators who are in this famous eternal valley of death. To right at the heart of the programme, I think a very ambitious set of clusters addressing these great challenges. And I think you will see that food and natural resources will be very visible in that. And it will bring together both the food system, the bioeconomy, the environment, and a number of the observation aspects of that, so that we will have the means to think and to programme together some of the solutions that are suggested in your study today. So I remain very optimistic. We always have to wait until the end of a budgetary discussion, but I remain very optimistic. We have some very good friends around Europe in the process, and I think you will see that the issue in the next few months together is to say, okay, alongside the usual business that we have to do, where should the emphasis be in terms of the breakthroughs that are needed, or a concentration of effort, or a connection of effort around the world? I see some of our colleagues here have worked before on areas like the microbiome, for example, where we are going to mobilise people. There are huge issues out there in terms of how we connect nutrition and health. I mean, basically food should be the new health in the world. It has always been historically. But in terms of products and services and so forth, how do we move there? How do we deal with the issues in our neighbourhood? Not just the Mediterranean, where we've launched a very major initiative on water and agriculture, but in a structured way with our partners in Africa, for example. And all of the issues around biologisation and digitalisation and the convergence of those two areas to impact most upon the people who need it first. So the microbiome, perhaps the place to start, is to get the effort to focus on the opportunity for the microbiome work to impact upon food and nutrition security, as you said, Joachim, for those who need it most, which I think is where we have to start. Apart from being the right thing to do, it's in our interest to do it. So there's a lot of areas, I think, where we're going to discuss them. I see Karina's here from the Bulgarian presidency. You're very much invited and welcome. Joachim will be presenting this report at the European Union's event with the Bulgarian presidency in Plovdiv in June. You're all very much invited to come and to sign up. There's a lot of interest there. And there again, we're going to convene the research, innovation and policy community to talk out what are the conclusions that we're drawing from all this analysis, just at the moment when we're preparing for what the detail of the next framework programme will be setting out in its strategic thinking over the next year or so. So this will be a very important moment, and I very much welcome the fact that Professor Van Braun has agreed to meet us here. You mentioned the bioeconomy. As the champion of the bioeconomy and as somebody who's led the Bioeconomy Village, Global Village last week so successfully at such a great event in Berlin, we're revising the bioeconomy, well, the strategy that we have in the bioeconomy. We're adding a series of actions which are refocused on how do we work within the bioeconomy as an agent of transformation to effect change in some of these issues, and food and nutrition systems will be a core part of that, which I think is one of the things we've talked about over the years. So I will stop there because there's so much that we can say, but I want to go back to where I started. It's not simply a very important report by a very distinguished group of people who give authority and evidence and weight to the approach. It's a very timely report, and we will need your support in the months and the years ahead to actually decide what should the direction of investment in science be, so that we can actually achieve something collectively and leave something behind for the next generation, hopefully, of equally enlightened people who follow us. Thank you very much.